Hi, mate.
Cheers. Well, thank you, Justin, and good morning, everyone. I'll just echo what Justin was saying. I'm very, very pleased to be back in person after so long. It's incredible how long this pandemic has been ongoing. And arguably, over the last 18 months, the business of television and streaming in particular has changed more than at any point in time, certainly in the history, the 15-year history, and it's easy to forget that Netflix started streaming 15 years ago. The change in the last 18 months during the pandemic has been fundamental. Most importantly, because we tend to talk about streaming a lot, we tend to talk about the subscription business. Most importantly, it's been fundamental for advertising, and I will come on to that as we work through the changes and the trends that have happened during the pandemic. So, firstly, the pandemic saw an inflection point. And that inflection point, this is Canadian data, but it doesn't matter which country or which region you plot this graph for, it looks the same. Sometime between 2018 and 2021, online video advertising overtook television advertising everywhere. Now, of course, a large chunk of this is Google and Facebook. It's not all sort of television equivalent online video advertising, but nonetheless, psychologically, it's a really key inflection point and fundamental to the changes that we're seeing in the industry as a result. Basically, where's the obsession? What is everyone talking about? What is everyone interested in? Whether you're a Hollywood studio, a traditional television channel, or a content producer, is driven by this fundamental change. Of course, we're kind of coming out of the pandemic, but we're not fully out. We know that there's a cost of living crisis in many regions of the world. We've got a war in Europe and other so-called headwinds, a phrase I particularly hate. But what that means for the traditional TV sector, by which I mean basically everything that isn't streaming, is that the outlook is somewhat flat. So of course we saw a big boost to advertising just after the pandemic, or as we were coming out of the pandemic, but that was a recovery from the impact of the downturn. And now we're going into a period that is effectively flat for the traditional television media. Even streaming, which has been growing absolutely astronomically over that 15-year period and grew even more astronomically during the pandemic, is beginning to slow, particularly in developed and saturated markets. North America, of course, is one of those saturated markets, but so is Western Europe, so is Australia, and a lot of the more wealthy regions of the world are hitting a saturation point for streaming. And growth is incredibly hard, or increasingly hard, to come by. So we see a slowdown in growth, not a reduction, a slowdown in growth for online video advertising and subscription OTT income as well over the coming couple of years. Of course, there has been a fundamental change in the business also happened during that pandemic period. Before the pandemic, studios were not streaming direct to consumers. They were supplying everybody else with content. They were showing movies in cinemas. They were not launching Disney Plus and HBO Max and Peacock and all those other platforms that came to life during the pandemic. What that means is it fundamentally impacts the content supply chain. Because the studios who make all that great content, those great movies and those very expensive TV dramas and reality TV like the Kardashians, are increasingly holding that content back for their own platforms, exclusively for their own services. even blockbuster movies increasingly premiering on streaming services. And so if you look at the supply, you can see that the studio platforms and even Apple, which is of course commissioning lots of original content, most of their content comes from themselves. They are self-feeding. But that fundamentally alters the supply to everybody else who is reliant on that content to attract their audience and bring in eyeballs and advertising dollars ultimately. What that means, just to illustrate again here in Canada, but it looks similar in many countries and regions, just in the last 18 months, if you look at streaming and you look at all the people who aren't studios, the supply of content has dropped by 4,500 hours just in that short period. So an illustration of that content holdback that changes the fundamental relationship between audience and content. The other thing that we're seeing, despite the boom in streaming, is that the number of streaming services that people are taking, these are paid streaming services, is flattening. It hasn't grown fundamentally in Canada, as this data shows, in the US, and in more developed Western markets for about 18 months to 2 years. So it's hit some sort of ceiling. But here's the fundamentally important thing for people in this room. Because it's not true that it hasn't grown, the number of services that people stream in the household. It's just that that growth has come from ad-supported services. So when we account for viewing of advertising-supported streaming, you can see that it adds, and most of that growth was during the pandemic, notice, it adds basically a whole additional service. So a fundamental shift from a paid business model to an ad-supported business model, and that means more direct competition for everybody in this room today. And so I have to admit something, and I struggle with admitting things like this, because what I'm about to admit is that I may not have been correct at one point in the past. So for years, I stood up on this stage here and other events that Justin organizes, and I said, there's no way Netflix is going to launch advertising. It doesn't fit their business. They're the premium streaming provider of the world. They have the first mover advantage. Never, never, never will they launch advertising. Well, what can I say? But it serves to illustrate a fundamental shift. And if we think now about the different services that are out there, and we think about the two types of business, ad-supported or at least partially ad-supported and paid, everybody is on the ad-supported side. Now I'm including Amazon there because we're Freevee increasingly integrated into the Amazon navigation system. They're effectively a hybrid ad-supported platform as well. Indeed, there's only one left on the pure subscription side, and that is Apple TV+. And of course, they have other sources of income that we're all aware of. So the shift during the pandemic, and again, I'll keep reminding you, this has all happened in the last 24 months, because this slide would have been completely wrong 18 months ago. Everyone was on the subscription side. Now everyone is on the advertising side. And that fundamentally, again, changes the competitive situation. Of course, why is it attractive? And this always surprises people. I'm sure everyone in this room is aware, but if you're a hybrid streaming service and you have a paid tier, a premium tier, and then a hybrid tier that mixes some advertising, you actually make more from each customer than you would with a pure subscription model. Now, the poster child for that has always been Hulu in the USA, but we've modeled out Netflix across the world in every country. And fundamentally, although we don't think the uptake of the Netflix ad tier will be as high as it is for Hulu, majority in the case of Hulu, it nonetheless means a boost to the value of their customers by launching that advertising option. Small in North America, because North America is about stabilization. That's where they've been losing customers, but significant in regions like Western Europe and Asia in particular. So creating a more valuable customer through the introduction of advertising. But what that means is that Netflix, and of course Disney, and of course HBO, and all the others that were on the left side of that slide, are increasingly going to be taking market share. And our model suggests that in Canada, Netflix will take around 6% of the online video advertising market by 2027, which is a significant market share. And when you layer in Disney and HBO and all those others who are going to take similar levels of share, again, it's a significant competitive challenge to the local players, wherever those local players may be. This is Canada. But again, similar graph could be plotted for other countries. Of course, what Netflix is facing, and all the streamers and pretty much everyone as competition increases, is a decrease in viewing. And that will temper some of that growth in advertising revenue that we're forecasting. In fact, they've actually seen their viewing time half in North America over the last 10 years, or will do when we account up to 2027. So a significant shift as the market fragments in terms of viewing, and that means, of course, that there'll be pressure on CPMs and ad loads, which they're currently at very low levels. So how do you compete locally? Well, we've talked about a lot of things. We've talked about the fundamental shift to advertising. We've talked about streaming competition. We've talked about the content supply chain. Content is fundamental to the competitive equation. As this graph illustrates, competing locally, the answer's pretty simple. You need good, local, recent content, preferably exclusively. So there's your answer. That's how you compete. But of course, that increasingly means that you need to produce that content yourself because your supply chain has shifted fundamentally because of the launch of those studio platforms. So Justin, of course, gave me 10 minutes, which is running out very rapidly. And he asked me if I could solve, in that time, all of the strategic problems and issues facing Canadian broadcasters. And so we've got sort of a minute and a half left. One slide. This is a distillation of some thinking that we've been doing and observation of best practice in terms of broadcast groups re-engineering. And what this is showing you effectively is that all of those changes, rather than running from those changes, it's about embracing those changes and flipping them into an advantage, because actually all of that shift in streaming presents opportunity as well as threat, of course. So if we start in the middle bottom, digital stroke streaming as a priority. It has to be front and center to the strategy. It's not about either or, it's not about one or the other. Streaming is the center of a television strategy in today's market. Following the audience, particularly the young audience, which is increasingly migrating to streaming platforms, whether that be an associated broadcaster platform or a newly launched brand, is absolutely key, and the audience increasingly is on those streaming platforms. Once you're in that market, of course, it presents global opportunity. Look at Salto, look at BritBox, look at other broadcaster-led platforms that have leveraged their launch to take content global, that they never had the opportunity to do so before. Obviously, that audience needs to be monetized across all of the platforms on which they are present and on which you are targeting them. And that means integrated and targeted advertising. Remembering that content is absolutely central. So original production, which then presents opportunity to work with streamers as customers, so streamers buying content to take outside the local market. So once you're investing heavily in local content that's going to recapture that audience, you can then leverage that in a studio-type business model. And that content within country needs to be local and exclusive. And when all those building blocks fall into place and fit together beautifully, you have the solution to a future-proof broadcast strategy. And with that, having run out of time, I'll say thank you very much. If anyone wants the slides, that's my email. Please do get in touch. Thank you.